Just a note before this episode. The following interview contains discussions of rape, abduction, sexual assault and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Claremont was a buzzing, wealthy suburb about 20 minutes from Perth, Western Australia. With pubs and bars along wide, safe streets, Claremont was known for its nightlife, with patrons often spilling out onto the footpath in the early hours of the morning. But that all changed in 1996, when the disappearance of 3 young women made national headlines. Claremont would become the backdrop for one of Western Australia's biggest, longest-running and most expensive investigations, which as of yet has not been solved. But more than 23 years later, as this podcast is published, a man is sitting on trial facing 8 charges, including the murder of Sarah Jane Spiers, Jane Louise Rimmer, and Ciara Eilish Glennon. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious cases by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with journalist Natalie Bongiolo about the case of the Claremont serial killer. Natalie is an executive producer on the Claremont podcast for The West Australian, where she has been following the trial as it unfolds and working alongside journalists who have been reporting on the case since the first woman, Sarah Spiers, went missing on a January night in 1996. So let's begin in January 1996. At the time, could you describe what sort of place Claremont was?
Yeah. In those days, Claremont was in its heyday. And so the suburb of Claremont is very well-heeled and a very affluent suburb. It's in the western suburbs of Perth, and lots of expensive homes, also some pockets of public housing. But it's a real vibrant entertainment area in the late 1990s. So there's restaurants and there's bars, and it's really busy, and quite often there's people spilling into the streets from outside the bars and clubs. There's a couple of really prominent places back then. You know, you've got the Continental Hotel, or we called it the Conti for short at the time, and you've got Club Bay View, which was this really popular club, and it really was the place to be. And I was kind of in my 20s in that era as well, so I used to go there myself. It was where uni students hung out, local affluent kids, young lawyers, celebrity footballers, all sorts of people there. It had a carefree party feel about it. And it was very, very popular.
And because it did have that nightlife and there were people, as you say, spilling out onto the street, did it feel safe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it was so busy that, you know, you'd come out of the club at midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was that many people around at times that, you know, you couldn't get a cab. It was really, really busy. And so you just felt like you're in groups. And, you know, people would obviously, sometimes if they couldn't get a cab, people would start walking down this main highway, which is Stirling Highway. People would hitchhike. And up until the first girl went missing, it did feel like a very safe, almost insulated a bit, I guess.
It was January 27, 1996, when 18-year-old Sarah Spiers decided to leave a nightclub at around 2 a.m. What do we know about what she did that night? What was that night like for her?
Sarah had gone into town that night. She had actually gone to a really popular pub called the OBH, which is on the beach. And then her sister had picked her and her friends up, and they'd driven them to Club Bay View, which is this really popular nightclub. And she'd been dropped off there just before midnight. And Sarah got out of the car, and she was very close to her sister. She got out of the car, she gave her sister a hug and a kiss and said goodbye. And her friends went to the club. So Sarah was in the club till around 1:30 or so, according to witnesses, and she wanted to leave, and she just said to some of her friends or one of her friends, I'm going to catch a cab, and she walked down the stairs. And, we've heard evidence from some of the people in the club who sort of have seen her walking down the stairs, and for some of them, of course, that's the very last time that they've seen her. The next thing that happens is Sarah does call for a cab. We know that happened because that recording was played to the court. And this was her ordering a cab from a phone booth on this major highway that I was talking about. And that was heard for the very first time and wasn't released to the media, but it was quite a eerie moment, I guess, to hear this girl who, we hadn't heard from for all of these years. And so what we do know, though, is the taxi got there and we did hear from that cabbie, but Sarah wasn't there. He picked up another fare and away he went. And we've also heard that a couple of guys who had left the club around 2 a.m, they reported seeing a girl leaning on a bollard, and she sort of looked up and they kept on driving. And, when you just catch someone's eye but don't really think much of it. And that's probably the last sighting of Sarah.
Did witnesses hear anything? Were there any other sort of pieces of information that could piece together those last known moments?
Yeah, so what we hear next, and this is in evidence that's been given by a couple of people in the trial so far, is we have these people woken by blood-curdling screams at around 3 a.m. in a suburb of Mosman Park. Mosman Park is very close to Claremont, and Sarah had actually been invited to go back and stay the night there with some friends, with a mother and her friend who lived in Mosman Park. So around 3 a.m, we hear, for instance, one particular woman, Judith Borrett, she describes hearing desperate, blood-curdling, terrible screams. And she obviously woke up and didn't know what it was. She's eventually gone back to bed, and she said later, she wished she had done something there and then, but didn't really know what was going on. We also heard from another young couple, a young guy and his fiancée, and they were also woken around the same time by a woman's loud screams. They also described them as blood-curdling. This couple also recalled hearing 2 loud car door slams, and one of them said that they saw some car lights, and that's all that they heard as well.
Good evening. The father of Sarah Spiers has opened up on the 21st anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. In a rare television interview, Don Spiers revealed the toll of losing his daughter and how it drove him to a breakdown.
I feel as though I have been absolutely gutted. I can't express strongly enough how someone's life can be changed and how torment can be implemented for so long because of someone's selfish behaviour. We've lost a loved one like a snap of the fingers. It's just there one day and just gone the next for the next 21 years.
So Sarah, we know, went missing that night, and her family didn't hear or see from her again. And then 6 months later, in June of that year, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer found herself at a nightclub in Claremont, and the line that she was in was exceptionally long. So what did she decide to do?
Yeah, so she actually had a chat to some friends outside in this line, and she had been out. She'd been at a pub, and then she'd met some friends at another pub, and they'd all caught this cab to Claremont. And so we do see eventually she goes in, but she comes outside. So she's outside, and there is this is where we have quite a lot of video footage of Jane at the Continental or the Conti. And in some of this video footage, you can see her outside. We've got a friend who has testified to say she's gone outside with Jane because she was upset, and they had quite a few drinks, and she was crying and saying, "Oh, I'm fat and I'm ugly and what have you," and seemed a bit upset. We don't see her upset in the vision, though. In the vision, she's smiling, she looks, happy, and she's chatting to people. What happens is then go to the club that you're talking about where Jane decides not to go in, Club Bayview. And her friends end up getting a cab and deciding to go home. They pass Jane, who's outside, and they yell out to her, "Come on, get in the taxi, come on, let's go." And she sort of just shakes her head. So they leave her outside leaning on a pole, and this is around just after midnight. And they say that she was, had quite a lot to drink. So in the footage, we see Jane standing alone. She's holding a jacket, and this is just before midnight. There's another shot of her in the footage, and this is just after midnight. At 12:03, she's still in this vision. The trouble is, this vision is on a loop, on a 13-second rotation. And at 12:04, the CCTV footage shows her standing there, looking around, and she actually looks like she's looking at her watch. And then 32 seconds later, the camera flicks back and she's gone. Nobody sees her go, nobody knows where she's gone, and nobody sees her again.
I think what you say about those conversations that she even had that night, there's just something so relatable that I think every young woman who's gone out just had those conversations and those emotional breakdowns, and to think they were the last moments is just really something that affects you when you hear about those, I think.
Yeah, you do, and I think that's the thing. Most of us identify with having had a night like that at some point in our lives, and it just must be so tragically sad for the family. Jane's parents, Jenny and Trevor, her dad Trevor actually passed away in 2008, but her mum Jenny and her siblings Adam and Lee, they've been in the court, and Sarah Spiers' family have been in the court, and it just must be so very, very difficult for them just to hear these intimate details and be reliving this. It's just a really tragic story.
It is, and it becomes more tragic because 55 days later, in August of that same year, a family were picking flowers in a nearby suburb. What did they come across?
This is in the suburb of Wellard, and Wellard is about 40 minutes south of Perth, and back then it is really semi-rural, and at that time there's only a handful of houses, there's a riding school, and it's a very, very quiet place. So 55 days after Jane has disappeared, there's a lady who is with her family and they're driving through there, and she asks her husband to pull over so she can pick some death lilies. And she goes into the sort of scrub. There's a bit of a hedge at the front, but actually behind the hedge, it's a wild hedge, of course, but behind the hedge, it's actually relatively clear. So she walks in around 2 to 4 metres and she comes across a woman's body. And just at the same time, up the road, not that far away, are a couple of horse riders who are coming from the horse riding school. And as they're sort of approaching this lady, they notice a knife on the ground. And at the same time, this woman looks up and she yells at them, "Don't come down here, don't come down here." They had a dog with them, so they think that maybe the dog's going to run down there. They grab the dog and they do go down, and they realise, and she says to them, "Oh, there's a body here." And so the two women at the time decide to stay with Jane's body while the two men go and call for help.
And is it clear to police who later arrive on the scene how this woman died and what her, final hours might have looked like?
Well, we know that her throat has been slit. She's naked, and of course she has been there for 55 days, so I think the body is in quite a state of decomposition. But interestingly, something that had actually happened the next morning after Jane had disappeared, there was actually another bloke who was riding his horse, and he was thrown off the horse. His horse was spooked by something. So Jane's disappeared on the early mornings of June the 9th. He's riding his horse that morning at this spot. His horse is spooked by something. He gets thrown off and he lands on the ground right next to a watch. And this watch is a Guess watch. And we know that Jane was wearing the Guess watch. At the time, he doesn't think anything of it, but he later gives it to his girlfriend and she just pops it away. from that time onwards, the residents in that area, when they're driving past this area that we're talking about, they notice this really awful smell. And as they drive past, they wind their windows up. And, of course, sadly, no one puts two and two together. This girl that's gone missing could have been right here in the bushes.
The Claremont serial killings trial has heard of the chance discovery of Jane Rimmer's body at Wellard 2 months after she disappeared.
Tracy Bell told the court today about a weekend horse ride in Wellard that turned into a nightmare. How on August 3, 1996, Tracy and her friend Stephen Daventhorn discovered Jane Rimmer's naked body in bushland. The pair had their ride suddenly stopped by a woman waving at them by the side of the road. I heard her say she had found a body. In a statement read to the court, Stephen Daventhorn said, "I saw exposed parts of a human body. The body was naked. I didn't touch anything." He also found an open brown pocket knife. It was in good condition and appeared to have only been there a short time.
On March 14, 1997, so that's getting to about 9 months later, 27-year-old Ciara Glennon was with friends at the Continental, where Jane had also been, and she didn't actually really want to be out that night, did she?
No, she didn't. She didn't want to go out at all. So Ciara had only been back in Perth for about 2 weeks because she is a lawyer. She'd taken a bit of a sabbatical and had a year's unpaid leave from the law firm she worked with, and she'd come back and she'd been back at work for 2 weeks, and she was actually back at this time because it was her sister's wedding. And so the next night was her sister's hen's night, and of course she was a bridesmaid. So this night at her work, they had these early St. Patrick's Day celebrations, and she'd had some drinks with the colleagues and friends, and everyone had decided they'd go to Claremont. She didn't want to go, and she hummed and hawed, and you know what it's like. People talk you into, "Oh, come on, it'll be great. We'll just go for a little while." So she really didn't want to go, but she obviously has jumped in the car and headed out for the night. So they got there, I think it was around 11:30, and they've gone inside, but she didn't stay too long at all. And Ciara actually was really only there for around 30 minutes, and she didn't really say goodbye to anyone. She sort of just slipped out sometime after midnight and left the club.
What do we know about what happened after she did leave the club? She would have probably been trying to get a taxi. Was there any witnesses who saw what she did, or if she called a taxi, or if she decided to walk?
Ciara's really interesting because there's a lot of sightings of Ciara after she left the club. And I don't know, it may be because, you know, we've now had 2 young women who have gone missing, and maybe people are more vigilant at the time. But these various people have come forward saying they've seen someone matching Ciara's description. She's quite small, a petite build. She's wearing a black skirt. She's wearing this light-coloured shirt. At one point, she's had her black work jacket around her waist, and she's got a black bag. And so there's several people who have seen someone matching this description. And she's seen walking down Bayview Terrace, which is where you would leave this area from the Continental Hotel. She's seen down at Stirling Highway, and at least 6 to 12 people have seen this. Now, some people have also seen a young woman matching Ciara's description, leaning into a white car, speaking to a lone man. The descriptions of him are, you know, not all that clear, but he's definitely a man, and that's kind of the best descriptions they have of that. Nothing too clear, but we know that she was talking to someone in a car.
A worker at a Thai restaurant saw her too, and has since said that she had quite an ominous thought at the time. What was that?
Yeah, that's right. So they've come out of work and got into the car, and they see her standing there by herself, and one of them says to the other one in the car, and this is around 12:15, "Oh, she might be the next girl to go," which is just, you know, I mean, tragic foreshadowing, but it also just gives you an idea of at this stage, there was this really heightened sense of alert around the area. People were worried. People were thinking about it. People were looking over their shoulders by this stage. And, Ciara, of course, had only just been back in Perth for 2 weeks, so maybe she wasn't as caught up in this intense fear at this stage.
Exactly. She hadn't been around sort of hearing those stories and getting that sense in the community. You can completely see how that would have happened. And then 19 days later, her body was found. Were police again able to determine what happened to her? And by that point, are they able to sort of know that this is one person that's perpetrated these crimes?
Well, yeah, when Ciara goes missing, police, there's a $250,000 reward is offered, and at this point it is probably panic stations. We've now had the third young woman in this short period of time go missing, and the words serial killer are now being used among the public, and police are very, very reluctant to say these sorts of things early on in the piece, but by this stage, definitely amongst the public, people are using the words serial killer, and of course Ciara is found just 14 days later. That is yet to come to court, so we've not heard about the finding of Ciara's body and the details, but we know that she was clothed and she also had her throat slit.
And now 27-year-old lawyer Ciara Glennon, back from an overseas trip to attend her sister's wedding, has disappeared in frighteningly similar circumstances.
These persons, certainly a serial offender, are generally pretty competent themselves, both socially, appear to be pretty well adjusted.
Psychologist Professor Don Thompson is an expert on serial killers. He says it's possible that Ciara has been abducted by the same person who took Sarah and Jane.
I think it's probably a sense of wanting to establish some power over both the individual and over the community.
And by this point, is there a clear suspect? Do they have any idea who this could have been?
Well, no, not initially. It goes on to become the biggest police investigation in Australian history. And what happens to start with is police really start focusing on taxi drivers, because we're thinking about, there's these 3 women who were all out walking, must have been, waiting for a lift. And so taxi drivers sort of all become the main suspects. And they are lined up, I can recall back then, taxi drivers are lined up for miles and, they're getting their DNA taken, they're getting their cars inspected, and there was a great lot of fear. And people, for a while there, when they started focusing on taxi drivers, people stopped catching cabs, particularly young women. You called your mum at 2:00 in the morning because you were so worried that a taxi driver could be a serial killer. Then in around 1998, police started to hone their attention on this particular public servant, and he lived in Cottesloe, and his name was Lance Williams, and he was a bit of an odd character, maybe a bit of a personality disorder, a little bit of a loner, and they had started to look into him. The reason they had started really to look into him was he had been driving around the area and picking up young girls or offering young girls a lift home. Now, he basically tells people that, well, this is because he was worried and he was out, looking after them and doing the right thing and wanting to make sure that they got home because there was a serial killer on the loose. Police really hounded him for really a good decade, and in 2002, when I say hounded him, they were parked outside his house across the road for years. They followed him to work every day. He was under constant surveillance. He repeatedly denied having any involvement. There was nothing forensically to link them to this guy, but they were really fixated on him. And in 2002, Alison Fan, who's a part of our podcast and a veteran reporter of 50 years and, reporting on Claremont now, she reported on Claremont back then in those days. In 2002, she went into Lance Williams' home and had this really long-depth interview with him, for hours, to the point where eventually she said, look, I'm going to have to go because this guy was happy to just talk and talk and talk. She was so convinced of his innocence and her gut instinct, she ended up ringing Dennis Glennon, Ciara's father, and said, listen, they've got the wrong guy. This is not the guy. She even called the assistant police commissioner at the time and said, yeah, you're on the wrong guy. So a lot of time was spent following this particular fellow. And it wasn't until 2016, in December, out of the blue, police charged a man, Bradley Robert Edwards.
Do you know what made her so convinced that it wasn't him, the reporter?
Alison just felt, I guess in her time with him, she spent so much time there with him that she said, yeah, he definitely was unusual and he was definitely a bit of an odd bod, and she felt like he had some kind of a personality disorder. But she just felt he was so open, and I guess the things that he was saying just didn't add up to someone who was out abducting girls off the streets and murdering them.
I'm here to make an important announcement to the West Australian community. Detectives from the Special Crime Squad have charged a 48-year-old Kewdale man with the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon and attacks on two other young women, a 17-year-old in Claremont in 1995 and an 18-year-old in Huntingdale in 1988. The man was arrested at his Kewdale home yesterday and charged in the early hours of this morning. It will be alleged the man abducted 23-year-old Miss Rimmer in the early hours of June the 9th, 1996, after she'd had a night out with friends in Claremont. Her body was later discovered in Wellard on August the 3rd, 1996. Police will also allege he abducted 27-year-old Miss Glennon on Friday, March the 14th, 1997, after she too had been out in Claremont. Miss Glennon's body was discovered in bushland off Pipperdinny Road in Eglinton on April the 3rd, 1997.
And you say that in 2016, Bradley Robert Edwards was charged, and in the podcast it's described as the culmination of a movie-like investigation. Can you tell us a bit, knowing what we know now, because as you say, it was completely out of the blue at the time, what investigation led to Bradley Edwards being charged?
Well, really, this is all hinges on forensic investigation. And what had happened is, obviously, over the years, police had been collecting evidence and forensic evidence, and this had been getting tested and multiple tests because, this was a huge operation and they were constantly assessing and reassessing and what have you. And they managed to link fibres from two of the victims, Ciara and Jane, to a young girl who had been raped prior to the disappearances. And then they followed this trail, this particular person, and then they've managed to, or claim that this forensic detail links the girls to this man, Bradley Edwards.
You say that there was a rape that linked these girls to the same man. What do we know about what happened with that incident? Because it's been making headlines all over the country because, as you say, it sort of hinges on this one incident that happened, I think, almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is the interesting thing. Bradley Edwards, when they charged him in 2016, they actually charged him with 5 counts. Now, 2 counts of the murders, but also with an attack on a young girl sleeping in her bed, which goes back to February 1998, and a rape against a young girl, a 17-year-old, in 1995. So the Karrakatta incident, there's a young girl and she's walking home again from Club Bayview. This is February in 1995. And she left at 1:30 and she didn't have any money, so she decided she'd walk back. And she's walking through this area close to Parkland. She doesn't hear anything, but in her statements, basically a man jumps out from behind, puts a cloth over her mouth, ties her arms behind her back, and then picks her up and carries her and puts her into a car. And then she estimates that they drove around for a good 25 minutes, and then they ended up at Karrakatta Cemetery, which is quite close to the Claremont area, or a very large cemetery and very green and very hidden. And he takes her out and he puts her on the ground and undoes the ropes and he rapes her. He then basically dumps her in bushland and he leaves. And obviously at the time, police then, she manages to make her way to a nearby hospital, calls the alarm, and police come and they take her straight away to a cemetery, and there they find items, and one of those items is her shorts, because she's obviously had those pulled off her, and they, take those shorts and they store them away and they test them. So the fibres that they find on these shorts are the fibres that they also find later on Ciara and Jane.
And he has since pleaded guilty to that rape, hasn't he?
Correct. So to start with, when he was first charged, he pleaded not guilty to both the Huntingdale attack on the girl sleeping, and he also pleaded guilty to the rape at Karrakatta. Now, just before the trial, he changed the plea to guilty on those two counts. So while he admitted, yes, he did attack a young girl as she lay sleeping in her bed, and yes, he did rape this 17-year-old back in 1995, he maintains that he has nothing to do with the murders of these three women.
What started out today being a normal run-of-the-mill pre-trial hearing ahead of Bradley Robert Edwards' proper trial due to begin next month quickly turned into the biggest story in Western Australia today when he changed some of his pleas. He's facing 8 charges. Originally, he pleaded not guilty to all 8, but today he did a major backflip and changed 5 of those pleas to guilty. He admitted to breaking into a young woman's home in the Perth suburb of Huntingdale in 1988, straddling her while she slept and attempting to tie her up, but she managed to fight him off and Edwards ran away. He also admitted today to abducting another young woman, a teenager, off the streets of Claremont in 1995, binding her hands and feet, putting a hood over her head, driving her to a nearby cemetery and subjecting her to a vile rape. But Edwards has maintained he is not guilty of the murders of Sarah Spiers and Jane Rimmer in 1996 and Ciara Glennon in 1997.
Let's go back to 1988 and it's Valentine's Day when that teenage girl is in her bed alone and she wakes up to someone lying on top of her, doesn't she?
Yeah, so she's had a Valentine's evening with her boyfriend at home and they've had a bit of an argument, and so he actually leaves and she goes to bed at 10:30. She wakes with the feeling of someone on top of her and she thinks it's her boyfriend has come back. He's come back to make up or what have you, and a hand goes over her mouth and she thinks that he's just trying to, don't scream or whatever, and so she sort of says, oh, I won't scream, thinking it's her boyfriend, and then she realises there's some fabric, but again she just thinks it's the doona. She reaches up with her other hand to touch his face, and that's when she realises that it's not her boyfriend, because she feels the stubble and she sort of digs her nails in and he flees, and she calls out to her dad, who comes running in, turns the light on, and there's these various items on the bed, a kimono and stockings and some fabric. That, of course, though, at the time goes unsolved. So she never finds out and has no idea until very recently who that person was. As it turns out, she knew him and they had gone to the same primary school and high school together.
That's so terrifying. And to think now that she knows who that is.
And to wait 30 years, remembering these two girls, the Huntingdale victim and the Karrakatta rape victim, for all of these years, they didn't know who this person was that did this to them. And so for them to now find out, and all these years down the track, obviously it would be bittersweet. On the one hand, they've got some justice. On the other hand, they're reliving this horrific time.
And these incidences start to really paint a picture of the type of person that Edwards is. And there are other cases. Can you tell us a little bit about the Hollywood hospital incident?
Yeah, so this is going way back, and this is prior to any of this. This is in 1990, actually. So at this point, Bradley Edwards is a telecom technician. So it's telecom back then, Telstra now. He's a Telstra technician and he's working and he goes to work at this hospital, which happens to be the same hospital actually where the Karrakatta victim went for help. So just another crazy coincidence. He goes in to do some work. He asks to use the toilets. A social worker is there in this area. And basically she hears the toilet flush and then she feels a hand around her face with a cloth on it and she's being pulled back toward the toilet. And she says, at this point she thought she was going to die. She struggles and kind of struggles out. Bradley Edwards, she says, I'm sorry. And he kind of puts his hands up. The security guard is called. Bradley Edwards is detained while they call police and he actually pleads guilty to common assault and he gets a 2-year probation. But he did have to, even though it's a common assault, he did have to undertake a sexual assault course or probation course or something like that. Interestingly, though, at the time, that incident, we've now found out through the trial so far, that incident doesn't get noted where we can see anywhere on Bradley Edwards' work record. So all that happens is he obviously leaves that day and apparently, according to the work records, he takes an hour's leave the next morning after the attack and he is back at work. So you see kind of this theme, and this is what the prosecution are kind of arguing. They see this method where he comes from behind, puts a hand over unsuspecting victims, drags them back and attacks or tries to attack them. And this is sort of the theme that the prosecution are saying, that they're relying on basically this pattern of behaviour.
And the prosecution too appear to be able to draw links between this pattern of behaviour and things that are going on in his emotional or personal life. So, for example, he's got a series of sort of bizarre relationships. The relationship with his first wife, they're thinking was sort of a trigger for a number of things. What was the nature of that relationship? Why was it so strange?
The prosecution are arguing that the attacks on the 3 victims are during points of emotional crisis or emotional upset. And late 95, 96, Edwin's relationship with his wife starts to break down. He's sort of becoming more interested in spending time on the computer. At this same time, she meets a man and they kind of bond over, she's got a horse and he's got kids who like horses, and they sort of start to bond. And this man's actually invited to move into the marital home. And in the trial, the reporters have termed him sort of the third wheel, this man who moves in with Edwards and his wife, and he then, according to the man's testimony, the third wheel's testimony, they have a sexual relationship while he's living in the house with Edwards and Edwards' wife. And there's a bit of a bust-up when Edwards catches them kissing and there's a heated argument. But eventually, everyone says, oh, we'll still stay, don't go. But a couple of weeks later, in his testimony, he says he moved out because he feared for his life. Now, what's been very interesting is the questions that the prosecution and defence do and don't ask. And, of course, he wasn't asked why he feared for his life at that point. So that was very interesting.
And he's not the only one who said that he feared for his life, because Edwards' second wife, I believe, told the court the same thing. Did she say why she felt like that?
That's right. Well, this was very interesting as well because, no, the second wife basically had obviously at some point become fearful, and she had even gone to the point where she had started to copy some of his bank records from a period back in the 1990s. She also said that she feared for her life and the marriage broke up and she moved out. But again, she wasn't asked what made her fear for her life.
Has Edwards said what he was doing on those nights? Do we have any sense of whether there's an alibi or whether he was in the area? Has that surfaced in the case yet?
No, so we haven't heard from Edwards and we don't know whether we will. So we're not sure whether he will take the stand. It's a $1 million question at the moment, and some people think he may, some people think he won't. So we're yet to find out whether he will or won't.
And what is his defence arguing? What is their primary argument in the case at the moment?
Well, of course, the thing with the defence don't really have to argue anything because the defence, Edwards is presumed innocent. He maintains his innocence, and it's really up to the prosecution to prove his guilt, not the other way around. He doesn't have to prove his innocence whatsoever. But of course, defence have already indicated that they see potential flaws with the forensic evidence. They're alluding to poor processes with the forensic evidence and cross-contamination with the people who worked at Path West, so some cross-contamination between the evidence. So they've already alluded to that, which will be very interesting because really, obviously, the forensic evidence is going to be very important, but they're saying there's going to be large gaps in the chain of continuity of these really important exhibits. Also interesting is when we've seen all the video, we've seen a lot of video surveillance and footage of people in the area, particularly on the night that Jane Rimmer disappeared. And while we're seeing all of this footage of, we're seeing cars and we're seeing people and all these people out on a night out, of course, what we never see is Bradley Edwards. We don't see the man accused in any of this footage. We don't see a car with a Telstra logo, which is what he's believed to have been driving or what the prosecution claim he was driving. So we know someone was driving a Telstra car and picking up people, but who was in that car we don't know, and there's nothing to show Edwards in any of that.
And the prosecution are relying on that narrative of the Telstra van that was driving around, and they've got what's being referred to as the Telstra living witnesses. Why are they so critical to the case?
I guess it goes to this patterns of behaviour again, but these Telstra living witnesses, around this time, these are women who were picked up from the Claremont area by a lone man in a car with a Telstra logo and who claimed to work for the company. And so far in the trial, we've heard from a lot of these people. And they're, for instance, girls hitchhiking after a night out, and they've got into a white van, and then we've heard them saying things like, oh, I got a strong instinct to get out of the car, and so they've jumped out of the car. Or we've heard from some witnesses who say they thought they were hailing a cab and only to discover it was a Telstra car. And even one woman saying she got so frustrated with this same Telstra car coming past over and over again that she kept thinking it was a cab only to see that it was a Telstra car. And another woman, Katrina Jones, she was actually coming home from a wedding because she had a fight with her boyfriend and she couldn't get a cab. Now she's got into a car, a Telstra van, and got a lift with this bloke. And she said to him, well, what are you doing? What are you doing picking up people at 2:00 in the morning? And he said something like, oh, well, I'm picking up damsels in distress like yourself. And he does drop her to her car. And after she gets out, he gets out as well and comes up behind you and tries to sort of kiss her. And she sort of says to him, she's been telling him she does Taekwondo. And she says, don't go there, I'll drop you. And he sort of backs off, oh, sorry. So there's lots of these people who say that there was a man in a Telstra car at this time picking people up. But of course, the defence says that there is, at this stage, there is absolutely nothing to suggest that these incidents involve a murderer.
No, exactly right. And we find ourselves sort of in the midst of this case, which is capturing the attention of the entire country. When will we have a verdict?
Well, it's been estimated that the trial will run, originally it was actually going to run for 9 months, which is such a long time. But because Bradley Edwards pleaded guilty to the Huntingdale attack and the Karrakatta attack, it's been shortened to around 6 months. So we're 3 weeks in. And we're expecting there would be probably another 5 months. And of course, this is where the real detail will come out, and the fascinating detail about the forensics and the fibres that they say link the 3 girls and the DNA that they say link these women to Edwards. But of course, the flip side is going to be how reliable this DNA actually is.
Absolutely. And I suppose either way, whichever way the verdict goes, I think all of us can really hope for is that those families of the victims will one day find out who was responsible so that there can be some sort of peace, whether it's in this trial or not.
And not even just for the families, I guess, for really everybody, because this has been such a dark it was such a dark chapter of West Australian history, and it really did change a lot of people, and people were fearful for so many years, and really everybody would like to see an outcome, you know, one way or the other in this case. And even people who lived here at the time and have moved away, you know, all of a sudden we just started hearing these. We'd waited for so long for anything, any kind of details. For 23 years, we would think, oh, is anything ever going to happen? And now, of course, we're just being bombarded with this information, and people are really gripped, and they want answers. So for family, but also for the wider community.
Yeah, I think there is that kind of even national investment in it, and it gives us hope for cases that do feel like they've gone cold and there's been no answers, that 2 decades on we can, perhaps still be finding answers. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You can follow Natalie's reporting on the Claremont serial killer case by listening to her podcast, Claremont, The Trial. For further reading on this case and photos and maps of the incidents and alleged perpetrator, just visit our closed Facebook group, True Crime Conversations. As this case is ongoing, evidence and details will continue to emerge. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper. You can contact us with the cases you want to learn more about by emailing us directly at truecrime@mamamia.com.au.